Okay, we all sort of know each other. We're gonna be performatively doing this in English for the benefit of hopefully anybody who's gonna be watching this. So this is an excellent panel. I know this because I know two of the papers on it already. And I know the rest of the people somewhat, so I know this is gonna be cool. It's about political extremism in the EU, and we're gonna have 4 papers. The first one is by Galbiton and Hassadeh. Another one by Ori Levy, who is presenter out of his co-authors. Third one by Galwan, and the last one by Noam Peterberg. We're going to do 12 minutes per paper, so I'm going to give you a signal like 2 minutes before we're done. And that's it. Just don't forget to share your slides so they get recorded. And I think we'll take it from there. Let me know if you need any help with the balance.
I think you already have it open on a different window, Val.
This one, right?
Just share it on Zoom.
Okay. So hi everyone, my name is Gal and I'm a PhD candidate here at Tel Aviv University. And today I'm going to present you a joint project with Professor Tal Sadeh, who is also my dissertation supervisor. And this project is about how voters react to Eurosceptic government's records. So I will start with explaining the motivation for this research, then present you the arguments, show you the empirical design, some results for the observational data, and hopefully I will have time to summarize. Okay, so since the 90s, European integration has become increasingly politicized, with Eurosceptic parties gaining more visibility and votes, showcasing mounting disapproval and skepticism towards the EU. There is significant research about why populist parties gain power. Factors such as cultural threats and economic inequalities are known to affect populist appeal. However, this is mainly true for radical right populist parties. However, not all radical rights are Eurosceptic, nor vice versa. Moreover, Eurosceptic parties mainly focus on opposing the EU, which set them apart from other populist parties. And most importantly, the literature, to the best of our knowledge, does not study how voters react to Eurosceptic government records, and this is what we try to fill. While gaining substantial electoral support, while gaining substantial electoral support, the success of Eurosceptic parties become highly unpredictable once they join national governments. Some even experience severe losses in subsequent elections, even when they accomplish significant success, such as securing more fiscal transfer from the EU. So this figure presented in front of you indicates that Eurosceptic voters tend to penalize Eurosceptic parties simply for being in government. And this one presents that when Eurosceptic governments secure more fiscal transfer from the EU, they are penalized by voters relative to mainstream ones. So our main argument is that since promising to minimize or stop European integration is easier than delivering, non-government Eurosceptic parties benefit electorally from increasing integration, European integration, while incumbent Eurosceptic governments are blamed if they let integration accelerate. Paradoxically, EU fiscal allocations can erode support for incumbent Eurosceptic parties, as their base might view these funds as a sign for more integration, European integration. So following this, we ask what explains the electoral setback of Eurosceptic governments. This study has important academic and, political implications. Hi. Examining the factors driving voters' preferences in European politics is vital for understanding democratic accountability and the implications for policies affecting countries' EU relationship. Our study hints that coalition with Eurosceptic parties can temper their electoral appeal and thereby influencing European integration, representation, and even broader political stability. Okay, so voters, we assume that voters are either supporters or opponents of European integration. Parties are either pro or anti-European integration. And pro-EU parties have a defined stance on European integration due to other privileges, for example, meaning left and right. Anti-EU parties center around the EU divide with a solid anti-EU base, but are internally divided on left-right issues, often leading to extreme right or extreme left. Okay, so focusing on pro-EU parties by pro-EU voters, we expect to see that if European integration accelerates, pro-EU voters' support for pro-EU governments will rise. And the support for those governments by pro-EU voters will grow if they secure more EU budget allocations. Okay, so focusing on pro-EU parties by Eurosceptic voters, we expect to see that if European integration deaccelerates, anti-EU voter support for pro-EU government will rise. And this is because anti-EU voters will find themselves in the conflict when voting to pro-EU party despite personal anti-EU position. But when they secure more funds from the EU budget, they will benefit from that. And this is why we expect them to support more pro-EU parties. But now let's focus on Eurosceptic parties when they're in government and what we expect anti-EU voters to react to their governmental records. So some anti-EU party supporters lean toward the extreme ends of the political spectrum, prioritizing political order over redistribution, while others value redistributive policies but oppose the EU. Therefore, we expect that Eurosceptic voters will support Eurosceptic governments when they go into slow European integration. However, they will support Eurosceptic governments when they secure more funds from the EU, but when European integration is accelerated. Okay, so this is a summary for the hypothesis, but I don't have much time, so I will just move on. So the empirical design, we divide it into two parts. We have the first approach is using observational data, and the second one is experimental design in order to deal with causality. So I will start with the first one, which is the model-based method. We analyze observational data to demonstrate the real-world plausibility of our argument. We are using a panel data of 1,283 election party observation in all EU member states between the 1979 to 2018. Cluster by state. The dependent variable is the percent change in party share of vote from the previous election, and we use cross-sectional RLS with cluster standard errors and election cycle and crunch to fix the fact. We use a dummy for party that has participated in government anytime since the previous election, and a dummy for polity Eurosceptic parties because we want to distinguish between a party that's in government and party which is not in government, and of course Eurosceptic versus mainstream. We have two proxies for European integration. The first one is well known in the literature, which is the index of the EU and European integration. And the second one is the percentage in the share of trade turnover with other member states, how much they engage in trade with other members. We also have a proxy for heuristic integration effects, meaning EU-related events near elections, and EU budget allocation, a change in the ratio of securing more transfer from the budget to GDP since the previous election, and we control for GDP per capita, unemployment rates, number of asylum application, and party size. Moving to the conjoint analysis. So this is the second part of our research. We are going to recruit 1,200 Italians. We focus on Italy because Italy experienced before a government which is skeptic, so it's not going to be very hypothetical to them. We are going to record their socio-demographics, general political orientation, trust in political institutions, and attitude towards the EU as pre-experimental measures. And the experiment setup is as follows. So participants are going to be presented with hypothetical profiles of two parties who are running for different hypothetical elections. And then we will ask them which one they prefer. Each participant presented with a total of 11 different pairs of profiles, when each profile contains 8 attributes. So the first 4 are whether they are in government or not, their economic ideology, social values, and European integration. There's European integration STEM. And we also add 4 hypothetical developments occurring at the national level before the election of each party for each election. So that will include 2 proxies for European integration. The first one is more in the Euros, so signing treaties, for example, and the second one is engaging in trade with other EU members. The third one is for a proxy for heuristics, so EU-related events occurring before the election. And the fourth one is regarding the obtaining more from the EU budget. So this is how that looks like. Then we ask them to choose between the parties, party A versus party B. And of course, we ask them also to rank each party. Okay, so let's address some potential problems that might already you think about. So we know that participants can be sometimes inconsistent, even without shifting from direct to indirect choices. Therefore, task 2 will be repeated again in task 7 with the exact same of pairs, but with reverse columns. So if I'm going back here, party B is going to be instead of party A, and party A be instead of party B, assuming participants will not understand that those are the same pair. And also, one might also question whether there is an effect for the information regarding that the parties being running in different elections. Okay. Hence, participants will be told that in task 1 that they are competing directly with each other, and in task 6 that they are competing in different elections, and then we will see if there is an effect. Okay, so we ran a pretest, but I don't have time, so I will move on to show you some results of the observational data. So the main findings are as follows. So mainstream parties see a 75% incumbency vote boost, but not Eurosceptic. Mainstream incumbents lose votes during notable EU events, though the heuristic measure. We also see that mainstream government parties that boost more fiscal transfer from the European budget are rewarded by voters. 1% GDP increase in obtaining more from this fiscal transfer boosts mainstream incumbents vote by 11%. We see also that Eurosceptic governments lose votes with formal integration progress, and high-profile EU events benefit non-government Eurosceptics. And lastly, we see that Eurosceptic government parties, which obtain more fiscal transfer from the EU budget, are penalized. They lose 30% vote share relative to the opposition for every 1% GDP increase in the OBB. Okay, so I will not go to say that. So just to summarize, we know that the literature focused mainly on explaining why voters vote for populist parties. But we don't know how they react to those Eurosceptic governments once they're already in government, and how they react to their actions. And this is what this study tried to fill. Okay, thank you. Are we moving, or now we do the question?
No, I feel like we should all present and then.
Oh.
Okay, so our next presentation, what do you want to go next, or would you rather?
Whatever you
go
decide.
last and
No, I don't mind, go the chill.
and be imperialistic about your extra needed.
I don't need any time, I'm good.
Yeah, you're good. All right, so let's do it. So
Okay.
next up is Louis Levy. The paper that he's presenting is called "Decomposing the Rise of the Populist Radical."
See it?
Sharing the screen though?
I think it is. I have your screen sharing,
Yeah, you should.
All right.
should be. Are we good?
Yeah.
Let's do it. Hi everyone, it's always fun to be back in Naphtali. I did my BA and Masters here, so it's always exciting. This is joint work with Ron Danieli, who's in my department in Econ in Tel Aviv, Noam Gidon, a political science at Hebrew U, and Shin Kikuchi, who's an amazing PhD student at MIT. So as people in this room already know, populist radical right parties have gained strength, especially in Europe in the last 20 years or so. Just to provide some numbers, around the year 2000, these parties had 7% of the vote. Today, they have about 20% of the vote. These parties are joining or leading governments. Think of Italy. They're affecting policy. Think of Brexit. And they're eroding democratic norms. Hungary, Poland. There's a large literature on populism. And like God said, mostly focusing on why these parties have gained strength. However, there's still no consensus despite this large literature. And in this paper, we'll take a different approach. Instead of looking at one specific covariate or one specific setting or country, we're going to take a bird's eye view. We're going to look at many party positions, many attributes of voters, their opinions, their demographics, many countries, all at the same time, and try to understand what accounts for the rise of right-wing populist parties. This is a descriptive exercise, I should say. Nothing I'll show you today is going to be causal, even though I'm an economist. It's kind of the exception. And we're going to basically compare three main theories that people have discussed. The first theory is that, I'm going to add time. The first theory is that these parties have gained strength because their positions have changed. So imagine, for example, populist parties moderating some of their positions toward new voters and thus gaining more votes. Or maybe, that's one example. I don't have time for multiple examples. A second potential class of theories is that voters have changed. This is the most popular explanation you read about in the popular press. Maybe today, voters have become more Eurosceptic. Maybe voters today dislike immigrants more, so they vote for the anti-EU parties or vote for the anti-immigration parties. A third explanation, which God alluded to, is that party positions can stay the same, voter opinions can stay the same, but priorities may change. I have to decide how much I prioritize redistribution versus being EU skeptic. So imagine a voter who supports the welfare state, but wants to stop immigration, and she has to decide which of these priorities should determine which party she supports at the ballot. We're going to compare these three theories. These last two theories are related to an ongoing debate in the political science literature on whether the rise of populism reflects a wave of nativism, a sea change in public opinion, or whether these opinions have always existed. There was always a base of potential right-wing populist parties, but these voters have recently been activated and started voting based on these opinions. And just as a quick preview, we'll find that the third explanation, there we go. The third explanation is the one that is strongest and accounts for the largest share of the rise of populist parties. So how do we do this? We analyze 22 European countries in Europe. We're going to merge wide data sets on the positions of parties and the attributes of voters. I'll discuss the data in a couple of slides. Then we're going to estimate the priorities of voters. This I will not have time to discuss today since I only have 12 minutes. And then we quantify the relative importance of each of these factors by holding the other factors fixed. And I'll explain how we do this as well. Finally, we analyze the key trends in each component. So let's discuss not the literature, let's discuss the intuition behind our model. We have a model that's estimating the priorities of voters, and using the priorities, the attributes of the positions, we can compare these three theories. So I want to show you, to provide intuition, what this looks like. Let's imagine a very simplified version of our model, and I'm intentionally skipping today the equations, a simplified version that has only three parties. A left-wing party that's going to be left-wing on economic issues, supports a welfare state, a right-wing party on economic issues, supporting low taxation, and a populist party that's moderate on economic issues, but conservative on cultural issues, against multiculturalism, pro-nationalism, against immigration. Now we can distribute voters on these two axes, this culture and opinion axis, and we can test which party each voter is predicted to support based on their opinions, while assuming, this is just an assumption for now, we're going to estimate this later. This is just to build intuition, while assuming their priorities are equal. And this is what we would predict. The voters on the left will support the left-wing party, those on the right-wing party, and the voters who are culturally conservative will support the populists. Now, what are the three theories we're comparing? Theory number one, it's possible that parties have shifted. For example, this left-wing party might have shifted to the left on cultural issues. It may have started discussing identity politics. That's what people have been arguing has been happening to the Democrats in the US, and that's why potentially they've been losing voters. So how would this look like in our model? We would see all of these voters over here. Oh, sorry about that. All of these voters shifting toward the populist parties, right? They have to trade off where they stand in economics and culture. Now that the left-wing party has moved to the left in culture, they're going to abandon that party. That's one theory that we can test. The second theory is that voters have changed. Imagine voters today have become more right-wing on cultural issues. They move upwards, basically. When that happens, many more voters are closer to the populist party. A third theory is that voters and parties did not change, but what changed is priorities. Culture became more important. When culture becomes more important, all of these borderline voters, those debating who to vote for, move from the mainstream party to the right-wing populist party. As I was saying, this is a simplified version of our model. It's only meant to demonstrate the mechanisms. In our actual model, we're going to not have 2 positions, but over 50 positions. And instead of having 2 opinions, we're going to have over 100 covariates because it's going to be data-driven, but the intuition is the same. So what are we actually going to use for data? First of all, for the positions of party, we're going to use the comparative manifesto project. This project basically codes what share of the manifesto of each party platform discusses each issue. I think the manifesto project and chess, which Gal uses, are the 2 main data sets used to measure party positions. We prefer manifesto since it's objective and we have good data over time for many parties, but both of these could have been used theoretically. To estimate the attributes of voters, we use the integrated values survey. That's just a combination of the World Values Survey and the European Values Survey. It's useful because we have data for 22 countries over time. We're going to analyze mostly 2 survey waves, one starting in 2005 and the second ending in 2020. And that's basically in terms of data. We have a wide range of countries in Europe, basically almost all important European countries with the exception of Belgium, maybe. And also a wide range of populist support. Some of these countries have no populist support, while others, the populist party actually has a majority. And as I mentioned, I'm going to skip the estimation of priorities just due to time constraints. So the final step is this decomposition. This I do want to mention in just 2 minutes because I think it's important. Once we observe the positions of the parties running for an election, we observe the priorities of the voters. What is priorities is conditional on my demographics and opinions, which positions do I care more about? That's how we define priorities. That's all there is to it. And we observe the distribution of the voter attributes. We can predict the share of populist radical right support. Now, we don't actually care about this prediction per se. We care about how it changes over time. So this is how much we predict populists will receive in Europe in 2020. This is how much we predict they will receive in 2005. And the nice thing about this expression, and this is the only equation I'm going to show this next slide, the nice thing about this expression is that we can rewrite it in a mathematical identity that allows us to do this decomposition. Now, what is this decomposition? I just want to bring a bit of an intuition. Let's look at this expression over here, the last one. What are we saying here? We're saying let's predict how much support populist radical right parties will receive using the voters that exist today, the parties that run today in elections, the priorities that exist today. So how much support will they receive in 2020? And now let's keep everything constant. Voters will remain constant, parties will remain constant, and only priorities will go back in time 15 years, and we see by how much support will change. So we're fixing everything, changing only priorities. And then we do the same exercise for attributes and positions. That's it, basically. So that's the design. I now have 3 minutes to show you a couple of results. So first of all, our main decomposition. We want to explain the rise of populist parties. We're going to define this rise just mechanically as 100%, because that's what we're explaining. How much of this 100% is explained by each factor? These are the results. 43% is explained by priorities. Priorities are the dominant factor. Party positions explain 1%. It's 2% in the early period, -1 in the later period. In total, 1%, basically nothing. Voter attributes explain, sorry, the pink here does not come out right, but voter attributes explain 11 - 1. That's another, sorry, 11 - 3. That's another 8%. Very little. They explain maybe something, but very little. There is a fourth factor, which I did not discuss today. This is the residual. The residual also explains a lot. That's basically the entry of new parties, which I won't have time to discuss. So the takeaway from this slide, when you hear people say that populist parties have gained strength because parties have changed their position. That's not consistent with the data. It's because voters have shifted their opinions. That's not consistent with the data. The reprioritization of issues, that is consistent with the data. In the 2 minutes I have left, I'll show you a couple of other results. First of all, which priorities have changed? So we can look at the distribution of the weights voters place on different positions. And I'm going to create an index of the two positions people care most about: economics and culture. Each of these is an index of multiple positions. Culture includes multiculturalism, national way of life, and so forth. And what you see here is that some voters, these voters reward parties with conservative economic positions. These voters punish parties with those positions, and these voters are indifferent. And the same for culture. How did this change over time? This is the results with the priorities that existed 15 years ago. What happens today? Today, we see many more voters who are indifferent to the economic positions of the parties. That does not happen for culture. In other words, relatively speaking, economics became less important in driving the decision of voters. That's one of our main results. We're not the first to make this argument. This argument has been made several times before. I think we're the first to provide comprehensive quantitative evidence for this argument. I'll show you one final result, and with this we'll finish. So I was saying that voter attributes do not matter. The opinions of voters do not matter. And I found this a bit counterintuitive because we constantly read articles like this in the press. This is just an example. This is about the French elections in 2020. And this expert says, but the other factor is the electorate, and issues such as law and order and immigration. In the last 10 years, there has been a slide to the right. So if there has been a slide to the right, our model should have found that attributes do matter, that opinions do matter. We said, you know what, maybe there's some mistake. Let's look at the raw data. We looked at the opinions that are most strongly correlated with supporting the populists, being skeptical toward the EU, prioritizing natives, thinking the country needs a strong leader. And here I'm just showing you the raw data, how each of these changed in the last 15 years. Each gray line is one country, and the blue line is the average across the EU. And you see that in some countries, people are more skeptical toward the EU, but in other countries, they're less skeptical. In some, they now have more negative attitudes toward immigrants, and in others, the opposite. When you look at the aggregate trends, the blue lines, on average, almost nothing has been going on. People have not shifted toward the populists in their opinion. And I think this is an important takeaway that we don't often realize, even though this is just really simple raw data. I'm out of time. I'll just conclude in like 2 sentences. So what do we learn from this study? A, changes in voter priorities drive the recent PRP support. B, this is inconsistent with theories discussing changes in party positions or a wave in public opinion. And a broader implication is, this is something I think people in this room already know, but it's worth emphasizing, that significant electoral changes can happen even when people don't change their policy preferences, by simply changing what is the most salient issue or the most important issue of the day. Thanks so much, and sorry for going 1 minute over time.
One is because of the phone going off.
And there we go.
So, it's an automatic edit. So our next speaker is Galwan from the Hebrew University, and your paper is a positive emotional dimension to right-wing populism.
Thank you.
Just switch to sharing so that you're on.
Should I stop the share first?
Just
You moved into a different application, so you need to stop share. Now reshare, but to the correct application. PowerPoint.
So hi, I'm Gal. I'm a PhD candidate at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And I'm excited to be here today and share with you a project that I'm working on with my advisors, Dr. Delia Osher and Professor Shana, on the positive emotional dimension of right-wing populist discourse. We know that this discourse, populist discourse, is widely known as to rely on eliciting emotions more than it relies on making logical argumentation. And it especially expresses and mobilizes negative emotions, anger and fear. However, we also know from literature on political campaigns and the process of persuasion that to successfully mobilize voters, leaders also need to get them excited towards the leader's candidacy and generally generates positive emotions towards themselves. Yet this aspect of a positive dimension hasn't received much focus in the literature on populist discourse. So in our study, we explore how a discourse that's so strongly associated with negativity also makes use of positive emotions, and we do this in the context of campaign speeches. The paper that I'll present today was submitted as my MA thesis, and on the basis of its findings, we're now developing a comparative study that will look at the discourse of Donald Trump and Marine Le Pen from their 2016 and 2017 presidential campaigns. We believe that offering a deeper understanding of how the populist discourse employs not just negative but also positive emotions can advance literature on their instrumental use and potentially also the impact of emotions in politics. So the research question was how and to what extent do populist leaders appeal to enthusiasm during their political campaign speeches? At this stage, the analysis was exploratory, so it focuses on identifying features of the text and characterizing the discourse. And also, it's currently done only on the US case study, so that's the findings that I'll present. But keep in mind that we'll also be adding the French case, and I'll say a little bit more about this at the end. We chose to focus on enthusiasm specifically because literature on political science identifies it as one of the three emotional dimensions that influence political behavior. It's also a complex emotion in the sense that it clusters together a mixture of positive emotions. So by measuring this one concept, we managed to capture a variety of positive emotions. And this complexity is suggested by its relatively vague definition as a passionate feeling in favor of something that's considered worthy. And also in the way that studies that measure enthusiasm have treated it as, maintained its ambiguity by treating it as feel-good appeals in general, or attributed or associated it with success and good times. Another important feature of enthusiasm is that it mobilizes to action. And specifically in the political context, it encourages a desire to get involved. And this is significant for our case because we look at campaign speeches, and that's exactly what they should be expected to do. So this concept of enthusiasm has many layers, and it doesn't have one definition, one clear definition. In order to identify how it's being cued in speech, how leaders attempt to evoke it, we needed to come up with a clear definition that specifies how it can look in the text. So we combined different definitions that previous studies have suggested and also how they treated this concept. And we offer this operational definition that distinguishes three types of enthusiasm. The first is confident future outlook, which captures the sense of hope coupled with a greater degree of confidence in the ability to achieve the desired outcome, whereas hope in itself is known to have uncertainty in the ability to succeed. The second is goal-oriented action, which captures the mobilizing feature of enthusiasm and mobilizing towards a desired goal. And the third is group empowerment, which captures notions of collective pride. In addition to working with the speeches as text, we also worked with the audio recordings of the speeches, and we marked on the text whenever an audience response was heard. And then we added these responses as another element in our operational definition, taking the response as an indication that the message resonated with the audience. So in order to identify a message as appealing to enthusiasm, it had to include both a textual indication as well as the audience response. The analysis at this stage, again, was done on 916 units of analysis, which together make up 6 speeches, 3 by Trump, and that were compared and contrasted with 3 speeches by Hillary Clinton, in order to better understand the role of positive emotions, specifically in populist discourse. Then in the annotation, in addition to noting the different types of enthusiasm, We also identified populist characteristics and tagged the emotional valence of the message, whether it was positive or negative. And just to note, this the textual annotation will follow the code book that we tested for reliability with the second coder. Our results show that both Trump and Clinton cue enthusiasm in their speech, and that they do so in an almost identical percentage out of their respective units of analysis. This is especially interesting given the fact that in terms of the overall balance of the discourse in general, Trump's discourse was more negative than Clinton's, and Clinton's was more positive than Trump's, which is also consistent with existing findings on populist versus non-populist discourse. But then when we look at this, when it comes to the specific positive emotion of enthusiasm, which is also, it could be considered a strategic emotion, it seems that it's as prominent in the discourse of a populist leader as it is in the discourse of a non-populist one. When we take a closer look at these units tagged as enthusiasm and their characteristics, we see a striking difference in the emotional balance of the message that's linked to the cue of enthusiasm. The graph here shows that more than half of Trump's appeals are mixed with a negative emotional balance, while most of Clinton's are purely positive. We can see an example of this in the quote here by Trump when he says, "Sadly, the American dream is dead." And then he immediately continues with the contrast saying, "If I get elected, I'll bring it back bigger and better and stronger than ever before." Now, if we think about it, these findings of how a populist leader employs enthusiasm and how closely it's tied to the negativity in the discourse fit well with what we know about the populist narrative and how it's, despite mobilizing so much negative attitudes, it doesn't end with an inevitable doom. This narrative unites, the narrative unites the people as an in-group through nostalgic references to a glorious past. And these leaders offer a vision of a utopian future while presenting themselves as those who can and certainly will bring it about. And now we're left with the question of where does the discourse, the populist discourse, derive its mobilizing force? Is it from the excessive reliance on negativity or from the cultivation of positivity? We hope to advance the answer to this question as we develop this paper into a comparative study that will include the French case, as I mentioned in the beginning. And we'll also try to predict we'll try to predict the audience response as a function of the text, and in this way measure the effect of the text. So we'll be examining how populist leaders appeal to enthusiasm, how these appeals interact with the negativity in the discourse, and how they resonate with the audience. As part of this setup, we'll also be making some changes to the variables. Specifically, we'll separate the audience response from the textual cue of enthusiasm, since that's what we now want to explain. And we'll also account for instances where the reaction of the audience is likely not a response to the essence of the message, but to a rhetorical strategy that's known to invite a response. This would be our control variables. We hope that this study will offer new insights on the emotional mobilization in populist discourse and what type of appeals to emotions seem to be more effective. And we realize that the effect that we're measuring is local. It's contained to the performance of the speech. But sometimes elections can be determined by a party's ability to motivate participation, just get their voters, their existing base of supporters to go out and vote. And maybe the way that they interact with these leaders interact with their audience during campaign rallies could be a first step to successful mobilization. So this is what we focus on. And I'd be happy to hear any thoughts you may have, as this is still an ongoing project. Thank you.
All right, great. Our last speaker is by Norman Wittenberg, Hebrew University, and it's called Northern Irish Electoral Behavior in the Age of Brexit.
Wait, you need to go back to the Zoom and share.
Actually, it needs to be the presentation window that you're sharing. So do what you did, put it on full screen, and stop the sharing right now. So it's not on yet. I think. Okay, am I wrong?
Yeah. Should I share the actual application or just the screen?
It's
Whatever,
it's fine. Yeah, let's do so.
Okay.
All right, good.
Right. This is front and center, Northern Irish electoral behaviour in the age of Brexit. Co-authored with Odelia Oshry and was just accepted by Irish Political Studies last week.
Congratulations.
Thank you. I'm going to start with the research question, which is how does anticipated violence affect electoral behavior in societies previously subjected to violence? The literature has been very divided on that. Basically, we have three different paths. We have literature that says that it facilitates reconciliation. We have literature that says that it increases polarization, and we have literature that says that it results in the in abstention from voting. What's more, most of the literature is very preoccupied with how this affects voting for right-wing parties, mainly how terrorism affects voting for right-wing parties. And so there's not a lot of literature on voting for centrist parties, which is what this paper deals with. So the case study is the Troubles in Northern Ireland. This is a very long discussion, but I've only got 12 minutes. So in its core, the conflict is a constitutional one, whether Northern Ireland should remain part of the UK or it should be united with the Republic of Ireland to the south. The hostilities broke out in '68, lasting all the way through 98, when the peace settlement was reached between Protestants and Catholics, with the trigger being discrimination against Catholics, basically denying Catholics in '68 the right to hold a very important rally. And this happens after years of systemic discrimination, which was somewhat reminiscent of what the African American community experienced in the 50s and 60s in the US. And so when the Good Friday Agreement, which is the peace settlement, was reached, it basically resulted in two things. Northern Ireland is simultaneously connected to both the UK and Ireland by the sheer fact that there is no actual border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland. Everyone can pass freely. Everyone can work, live, and study both in the Republic of Ireland and in Northern Ireland. And it also facilitated the mandatory consensus that has to be reached for any political decision to be made. So basically, Northern Ireland has to follow a mandatory political parity for as long as the agreement is in place. And this resulted in what I like to call a relatively secure sandbox, where there is an institutional framework that guards people from any major repercussions. And so it enables them to explore new political and electoral opportunities without fearing that a regression to violence is imminent. So since '98, there have been changes in three main categories of identification in Northern Ireland. So basically, neither unionist nor nationalist, meaning people who are satisfied with the status quo and do not actively campaign to either reunite with the Republic of Ireland or remain part of the UK. They're comfortable with the way things are. People who identify as Northern Irish rather than Irish or British, and people who are a-religious, meaning they reply when asked for their religion in surveys, they reply no religion at all. As you can see, there's been a significant increase in all these categories since '98, resulting in the formation of a very large community that rejects the traditional way of thinking in Northern Ireland and is therefore more open to considering new electoral opportunities. Now, here what we see is how the electorate reacted to being asked about the relations between Protestants and Catholics after '98. The grayed out zones are periods where there was a spike in violence even after the agreement was signed. And what we can see here is that whenever there is a wave of violence, the electorate immediately reacts, thinking that the relationship was better 5 years ago than it is today. So the electorate is very, very sensitive to these changes. And what we also can see is that in 2016, after Brexit, there is also a very significant decline in the way people feel about this relationship, and it's very close to how they felt in '98, right after the agreement was signed, and there was a renewed wave of violence by paramilitaries who did not accept the signing of the treaty. So what happened in 2019 in the UK general election that was held in Northern Ireland? We basically on the left have the parties on the two polar opposites of the political map. We have the DUP on the extreme right, and we have Sinn Féin on the extreme left. And on the right, we have all the parties that form the center ground, meaning the centrist parties in Northern Ireland. So we can see that over 12% of voters stopped voting for parties on the polar opposites of the political map in Northern Ireland, instead switching their votes to the center. Why 2019? Because it gives people enough time to come to terms with the perceived repercussions of Brexit in Northern Ireland, which were a renewed wave of violence and fearing that the treaty would be effectively nulled. So the vote composition for Alliance in 2019, which is the party on the very center, in the very center of the political map, is interesting because, as you can see, some of the voters also voted for Alliance in 2017, but in fact, most of the voters either didn't vote at all in 2017. Many of them voted for the hardline parties, the parties on the polar opposites of the political map, both the right and the left. Some other voters voted either for parties in the,
Sorry, just for clarification, when you talk about right and left in Northern Irish politics, is this similar to what these politics are in the UK, or is this about like
very much
your
so.
position about Irish
In terms of economics, is very similar to the UK. Obviously, the DUP on the right want Northern Ireland to remain part of the UK. Sinn Féin want Northern Ireland to unite with the Republic of Ireland.
So which is it, or is it both?
It's both. Yeah. But in terms of economics, the DUP are conservative and Sinn Féin are somewhat liberal. It's kind of hard to ascribe liberal to Sinn Féin, but it's the polar opposite in terms of economic views. So very socialist. So as we can see here, most of the voters who voted for Alliance in 2019 are actually new voters who have never voted for the party before. So when we look at motivations for voting for Alliance, and this comes from surveys, we see that in 2017, 13% had voted tactically, meaning they do not actually identify with the party, but they want to prevent some other party from winning and gaining more seats in the local parliament. Whereas in 2019, this more than doubled. 27% had voted tactically, and out of those who voted tactically in 2019, almost half had previously voted for other parties. So this means that a very large group of Alliance voters do not actually identify with the party, but they actually want to draw power away from the extreme right and the extreme left. So in terms of the mechanisms at place, what we end up with is that voters ask themselves how to achieve the best payoff in any given scenario. So when risk level is low, meaning the agreement is in place, there's no danger of anything happening to it, there's a zero-sum game where people feel safe enough to vote for hardline parties to make sure that their side, meaning moderate voters on either the right or the left, feel comfortable voting for the more hardline parties to make sure that their group receives more concessions, whereas the other group does not. However, when during Brexit, for example, risk level is high because Brexit undermines the very tenets of the agreement, meaning there's probably going to be a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic, and people are not going to be able to move freely. Goods are not going to be able to move freely. People think that there is going to be a regression and reappearance of extreme violence. This is when the game turns non-zero sum, and people want to vote for more moderate parties to actually de-escalate the situation. So what we can see here is that people utilize a dynamic threshold to actually determine who they vote with, depending on the security situation in the region. So whenever security becomes more salient, because people fear that the agreement is not going to hold up, they vote for more moderate parties. Whenever they feel that there is relative assurances that the agreement is going to remain in place, they want to limit the concessions that the other side is getting. And just to wrap things up, the two main contributions are how the electorate utilize constitutional agreements to shape the electoral playing field, meaning, as I just discussed, when people feel relatively safe enough in their environment, they vote for more extreme parties. They want to make sure that their voices are heard louder, because power sharing dilutes the individual effect of their vote. And when they feel that there's going to be a regression, they actually vote for more moderate parties. They feel like their priorities have changed, and they want to make sure that the situation is not going to deteriorate further. And lastly, the use of party competition as a balancing mechanism. So voting for an extremist party isn't necessarily an indication of an extremist voter. Moderate voters can also vote for extremist parties as a way of balancing out what the other side is getting. Thank you.
Right. Very much. So, we've got the rest of the time for discussion. And what I propose is that we take questions, we do them one by one, because I think that'll be a better format for everybody to get their answers, get their questions answered. But I reserve the right to change it this month. So please go ahead and start questions.
Yeah, for LOE, I wasn't sure when we compare two terms, salience and priority, whether you see them as the same thing or not, because in your histograms, you seem to suggest, if I understand correctly, that when you vote for the center, you sort of signal that this is less important to you. But we just got a paper saying that people can vote tactical. In other words, you can decide to vote for the center because it's very important to you that the extremes don't win. It doesn't mean it's not the issue itself, whatever it is, whatever, economic policy. Doesn't mean it's not important to you just because you're a centrist. I'm more familiar with operationalizations of salience using precisely the manifesto. You have the ever measures, so if you can clarify what you mean about that. And to Noah, I like how your study ties in with other evidence we have in the literature about voting for extreme parties, that paradoxically, sometimes the vote for extreme parties is associated with good times, not with the hard times. And the explanation for that line of findings is that people are more willing to experiment with new parties or radical ideas when they feel secure. But when they feel insecure, they want safe hands, and they tend to vote for mainstream. It's conflicting. Sometimes the evidence is the other way around. But your finding would fit in that line of literature. I was wondering, when you showed the diagrams about the rise, if I would say the center, or the rise of the electorate that is non-affiliated or is not partisan in the classic divide in Northern Ireland, it seems to be leveling off at about 10 years ago. I mean, there's a clear rise if you cut it somewhere in the mid-2010s. And what follows in your diagrams is some fluctuation that doesn't seem to have like a trend anymore. Have you noticed this? Is there a reason for this?
So yeah, great question. So first of all, you're completely right regarding strategic voting. We assume for the paper sincere voting. I would say that I think in our setting it makes most sense because we're looking at survey data, not an actual election data. Now that has many disadvantages. One advantage that it has is that when people are asked in a survey that's conducted like 1 year before after an election, which party they support, they're more likely to answer honestly instead of thinking about like which party is going to join which coalition and which party is going to be close to the election threshold. And the second thing is just a clarification. The solution that I showed is not whether you vote for a centrist or right-wing party. It's kind of how much weight you put on economics or culture. And now your third point is how we interpret this. Is this salience or is this importance? And that's an open question. And here we cannot disentangle those two. So I keep using the word priorities, but I want to be very clear about what I mean by priorities. What I mean by priority is conditional on your covariance, your opinion, your demographics. How much do you care about each party positions? That's what we mean. Now, you can tell a story that what determines how much you care is how much you think each of these is important. But you can also tell a story about how much you care depends on just what you happen to be thinking about at that moment, which is salience. Yeah, exactly. Planning or salience story. And we cannot distinguish those two, and I think both could be the driving factor behind these priorities. You can even tell a story about legitimacy. Maybe you read this like in a different, you tell yourself that should not be a consideration when they decide who to support. So I'm going to put a very low weight on that, even though I have an opinion on the topic. That could also be. So legitimacy can also affect priorities. All of these can affect this priority parameter, and I think it will be interesting for future research to have how do we disentangle them.
So yeah. Basically what we found is that there's a growing pragmatic, if you will, share of the electorate that's comprised of two groups. So one of those groups is basically the non-partisan individuals that I showed. It's true that it starts to even out towards the end. We did not actually examine why this occurred, but my conjecture would be that it's a group that's slow in development. It's taken basically 20 years to reach a near 20, 21, 22% share, because it's a very ideological driven region. So these processes take time to actually mature. But the other group that in the pragmatic electorate is people who do affiliate themselves with a certain religion in the region, or people who do have a constitutional preference, but they still find it very hard to prioritize these affiliations at a time when they feel that the earth is shaking beneath their feet. So there's two groups. One of them is actually very rejects the traditional way of thinking in Northern Ireland, whereas the other one does affiliate with some of the main tenets of identity in the region. However, they feel like they have to reprioritize according to the security situation in the region.
Thank you. May I suggest that the panelists take their seats for the sake of the recording? It would be funny for people to watch the recording and have this Q&A session with no faces at all.
I see. I'm only doing the
So-
and so you
Remove
gotta.
the sharing and have you all just sit there for the.
All right, go and do it. In the meantime, as you make your way, I'll go to have a question, so.
Yeah, just two question, one to Gal.
Yeah.
Gal.
Hi.
Yes.
I'll take care of your thing.
Yes. Can are you listening?
Who they are, there's a lot of, so-called Eurosceptics that are, they were yeah, even older. They want to change the European Union problem within. That's another story, but they're not Eurosceptics, they're very much pro Europe. The question is, would you include them within the concept of Eurosceptics, or they are part of the European Union, they want to change it within? Probably legitimate. This question, another question to Gal, to another Gal.
No, three.
He said, kind of, I got confused between the positive and the negative kind of feeling in terms of. These parties are Schmidt. They're still Schmidt from the scratch. For politics, you need an end. It's no politics down in. And they're doing, I mean, what's it, I mean, obviously it sounds very negative. But a positive and negative part of the feelings, because they go into it, I mean, I produce feelings by defining the enemy. And so there's a negative, I put all the negative things inside, but I develop my positive thinking of why I'm so good. It has to be an image, a myth, it has to be an image of very limited intellectual, but it has to be perceived as an image. But I wonder if that's the negative positive that you're talking about.
Can I follow up on that very briefly? Just with a question. So I also didn't understand this completely. Like, for example, when Trump says lock her up, Is that enthusiasm? Is that considered? And because it's kind of it's negative, but it's on an enemy, but clearly the audience is excited. So just kind of as clarification.
Okay, so I think I can explain the index better than you,
Yeah,
right?
but-
Because it's an ER.
So theoretically, we're aiming at the polity Eurosceptics, not the policy ones. So if a policy Eurosceptic would be someone would say, you know, I'm all for the European Union, just, we shouldn't have a single currency. Let's go back to the days where each country had a currency, but I like the concept of cooperating. A polity Eurosceptic would say, I don't like the whole thing. I don't think there should be anything limiting the autonomy of the state in Europe. We shouldn't have all this. I mean, we should do bilateral deals if we want to bargain with another country, okay? But we don't need any European Commission, any European Parliament, any European Council. We are against the idea of a single Europe with some vision of something greater than the state or something like that.
That's okay.
So these are the people ending up. Now, in operational terms, in the observational data part, we're using the manifesto chess database, and we're simply doing a distribution analysis. We're just taking the top quartile, the most anti-EU statements in their manifestos, and we call them Eurosceptic. In the conjoined part, we simply we keep it simple, because when you ask people about this, not all of them went to university and have immersed themselves in the different shades of Euroscepticism. And we don't want to ask them, sometimes we got comments that we should ask them practical questions, you know, so that they know what we mean by being anti-Europe. That's another quagmire, because they each understand it differently and may latch into different aspects of Europe in different ways. So we just ask them, when we ask them about their opinions, we ask three things, right? We ask, if there was a referendum today, would you vote your country to leave the European Union? They say that's a Eurosceptic. Okay, for example, there's that famous question about whether we feel more Italian or
Yeah.
more European. So that's another one that we put in to measure people's inclination. There was some other thing, and to identify the position of the parties, we just put it very simple: very anti-EU, moderately anti-EU, centrist, pro-EU, very pro-EU, and we let each respond and make what they want out of that. It's pro, anti, it's very black and white.
So I'll try to clarify this. What we mean by when looking at the emotional appeals is what are these readers saying to entice in the audience either a positive reaction, like a positive feeling, or a negative feeling, being discussing things that would hurt them, they would not feel comfortable with. So the lock her up, for example, if it's said by Trump to his supporters, this is something they want. And yes, it would be bad. So the specific statement can be negative, and that's when we see the positive and negative, because once we identified a hue of enthusiasm, it was automatically positive, because enthusiasm is a positive emotion. But according to what the message also said, it could be also negative.
So I would call enthusiastic genocide, right? If you, like in, not
Sadly.
tragically, Rwanda, right? Made all these radio calls to go and get them. That's enthusiasm. No, I understand. Methodologically, you're consistent.
No, but we wanted to focus on how do these leaders speak, and how do they insert these emotions that are so heavily manifest in their speech.
Like just one word to this, of course, yeah, that's true. But what did Goebbels do? Exactly that, like he incited this kind of euphoria in Germany to commit genocide, to start the total war. So yeah.
Other questions here? So I want to follow up on that as well. I'll monopolize sometimes. I think, because these terms seem to coincide with each other so strongly, right? Like you can be enthusiastic about negative and positive stuff, and you're finding similar levels of enthusiasm. It kind of begs the question of what is the purchase of this concept, right? So say that you can identify it and measure it, but what does it help explain that we can't explain without it? What sort of questions would this be useful?
I think it relates to understanding the rhetoric and the impact that it can have. I think that if we identify how they manipulate us, because a lot of decisions in politics and life are motivated by how we feel. And if we can identify how leaders manipulate these emotions to make us feel something, maybe we can be more critical when we hear these appeals, when we hear them speak. And also to the other side, I think if we have a better understanding of how to use specifically enthusiasm, because it's considered strategically motivating action, participation. So I think if some leaders are now using it more than others, maybe they have an advantage that's just, on a different level. One is talking to us about practical stuff, the other one is making us feel something, and that's what's, not everybody, of course, because but I think this is an important issue that it could contribute.
It's interesting. It begs the question of whether what you're looking at is excitement or like activation. I mean, obviously it's enthusiasm, but you're definitely referencing it as something positive. But it seems like it's directly tied to charisma, right? In that it would be interesting to see, like, from the receiver side, whether somebody who listens to these kinds of speeches like also experiences them as, like they report being more enthusiastic or not, or like are they actually reactive to it, and whether this has to do with the level of enthusiasm or with like a general affect that the speaker has. And I think that would be an interesting thing for you to try to unpack going forward. If the question is, what is it that certain leaders use and others don't? There's this whole literature on leader perception that assumes and measures leaders as being more charismatic or valence increasing than others. And this could be the result of a lot of things, but it's a question of whether this is a strategic decision to be more enthusiastic or whether this is just a quality that people have. Donald Trump is very charismatic, so this, it might be the case regardless of whether he's a populist or not.
Yeah, I think we could relate to what you're saying when we separate the measurement of audience and the textual cues. And then we could also add, for example, Emmanuel Macron, which would be the comparison for Le Pen. He's also charismatic, and he also uses a lot of emotion. We haven't yet analyzed this, so I don't have any results to share, but it would be interesting if we find specific trends in the populist leaders and the non-populist on all the levels that you mentioned.
Okay. And I had a couple of questions. They're not about the substance of your analysis, because I feel like this has been covered by all of the comments that you've received throughout the last, I don't know how long it's been since we've been working on this project. And also I just find it extremely compelling. So I'm going to ask you a couple of questions that are perhaps extensions of what that just interest me specifically. So the first one is about that unexplained part in which I'm sure you've got. So I'm just curious to hear kind of your theories around it. There's a big chunk of residual that's left, right? And it's important because I find it striking because you're looking at change rather than actual like base rate levels. So I wonder what your thoughts are on what else is going on there. Because your theory seems very comprehensive. I think that those three concepts would capture a lot more than we do.
So in theory, this could be some kind of misspecification in our model, or voters kind of randomly voting for parties for reasons we cannot explain. But what seems to be happening in practice is something simpler than that. It's the entry of new parties. Now, the entry of new parties, we cannot consider this a change in party positions because the party did not exist. But it's not related to a change in the attitudes of voters. What we find is that based on our analysis, there was room for these parties earlier. They could have theoretically entered the political system earlier, which means that once they actually do enter, that increases substantially the votes for the populists. And this begs the question, why did they not enter earlier, right? Kind of what's going on here? Why is this such a big chunk? And there could be two potential explanations. One is just like a supply side shock. for some exogenous reason, every once in a while, someone decides to create a party, notices that there's this gap in the electorate, and gains some votes. And then you can think of this as just yet another supply side story. We don't think that's what's going on, because we looked at the actual data and we saw that some of these parties did exist earlier, but they just failed to get any votes that may allow them to enter parliament. Or maybe these parties did not exist, but a similar populist party did exist. So what we think is going on here, we think actually strategic voting matters. We think these parties existed, but they received maybe, I don't know, 3% of the potential support in polls. But voters realize that a party with like 3% of the vote does not even enter parliament, can have no impact. So they chose to support a different party. Once priorities changed and that 3% became 6%, all of a sudden these parties support increased from 0 to 6, even though they already had this potential 3. And all of this is
latency, in other words.
yeah, it's not exactly latency. It's like you need something to change. You need some trigger. So that's the priorities, and we do find that priorities explain a lot. And once those priorities change, or once parties find some other way to kind of coordinate their voters, overcome barriers to entry, then everything else is attributed to this residual, and that's kind of the entry of new parties.
Pretty cool, because there's some like good evidence on, like, it's not community-based evidence on how when certain extremist parties enter parliament just by, you know, like, just by a very marginal number of votes compared to those who miss entry to parliament by a very marginal number of votes, and you compare their trajectories, it immediately creates more demand for their from voters. So at least it's consistent with it, I guess. And the other story is really not about the questions that you're asking, but it's interesting to me. Just to preface, I'm dealing with the politician side of that. So what do politicians think about voters and so on? And one thing that is interesting is, like, there's a puzzle here, right? Like, because if it's just about salience, then why do parties at the center right or center left shift their positions, or say that they shift their positions in face of the existence of these populist parties, right? If they know that what matters is salience, they could just talk about other stuff rather than change their position. But we see center-right parties in Europe changing their position on immigration, not just talking about it more, right? So there's a question here of, do the leaders of these parties have the same theory of change as you document, right? Like, if we went out and asked them, would they say that the success of these parties is the result of increased salience of these parties as issues, or of an actual change in their votes? And I'm saying this because I feel like this is a question that could be answered. Like, we can go out and do that in some of our projects. But my question to you is, what's your intuition? Like, would you expect them to be aware of this? Do you feel like this is something that has been broadly discussed in a way that should affect these decision making, or is it not?
So first, I should say now my answer is kind of just, it's not research based, right? It's you know this much better than I do. So the only reason I'm answering is because I'm sitting right here. No, so what is research based is how these parties have changed. So here you can see how these parties actually changed in terms of their positions, and they did not change dramatically. Kind of the mainstream right-wing parties, if anything, moved a bit to the left on cultural issues, but there's no dramatic changes. So maybe they attempt to shift, but maybe they can't because of constraints, but the position did not change dramatically for the mainstream parties. Now, in my opinion, it seems like at least the strategists know what's going on, because we know based on a lot of empirical evidence that it's really hard to persuade voters. It's not impossible, but typically you put in a lot of effort and you get like 1% of the electorate. But on the other hand, to change your priorities might be a bit easier. And we see this in campaigns all the time. Like, it's the economy stupid, right? Let's make this campaign about economics and not about foreign affairs. We saw this recently with the Republicans in the US, right? So Biden was doing a pretty good job. Like, the economy was doing well. Like, he had support for his bill, and they started discussing other things. They started discussing kind of critical race theory all of a sudden. Why were they discussing that? Not because they thought that this is the most important issue, but they thought that on this issue specifically, they have an advantage. And this was clearly a coordinated decision. They just stopped discussing some issues and started discussing others. So yeah, I think I can't say that like every single politician understands this, but I think the strategists definitely realize that the way they can win elections is by deciding what is the issue of the day, and not by persuading voters that their opinion on specific issues are correct.
I can add that in the Euroscepticism literature, there's a lot of dealing with this. In our study, based on what I did with Yoav last team, you have the heuristic effect. Simply because the European Council convenes and that's reported in the media, people are reminded that there's this business, supranational business going on in the European Union. And that's like a ratchet effect in favor, and that all that matters then is how proximate this is to the election. And we measure this, so the more you're closer to the election, these things happen. That's a shift for the Eurosceptics, they build on these things, which what happens then is the mainstream parties try to bury this activity. And they certainly, so that's strategic, they don't like to schedule new treaties, new referendums, European Council, not on the eve of elections. Because there's no way that they can twist this into something that will benefit the mainstream parties. So that's kind of heuristic, I don't know if it's a movement of European shark attacks. Or this is, or people actually think, logically, yeah, I don't like the European Union, because if they did, then you'd have a more symmetrical effect. If people thought rationally about these events, if some of them were reminded how good it is that there is a European Union, and they vote the other way. So it's a very asymmetric effect, which leads certainly deliberately your mainstream politicians to take the whole EU issue off the table and not to try to discuss and brag about it. Take it off the table, whereas the Eurosceptics, often radical right parties, look for these events to make a big deal out of them, hopefully post election.
If I may also add, if I may also add, from our own research, for example, Sinn Féin never take up their seats in the UK Parliament. So voters in Northern Ireland over the years have been voting for a party that will never vote on any issue in the UK Parliament. And remember that what we examined was the UK general election. So people over the years have been voting for a party that will never take up its seats in Parliament. And for the first time in 2019, you actually saw people in surveys who are traditional Sinn Féin voters saying, this is now a problem. So there has been literally no change in party policy. Sinn Féin has never taken up seats in the UK Parliament, but for the first time, voters are actually viewing it as a problem. We potentially will be voting for representatives who will not be able to represent us in any vote. And so they shift their votes to other parties whose representatives will take up their seats.
I think there are certain pool of issues that the people of center right are moving toward that. I mean, it's if you're talking about immigration, if you're talking about multicultural society, whatever, people are moving a little bit to the right, being against that. But at the same time, the populist right-wing parties are moving to the center. I mean, they just leave aside. That's what that question of the Eurocenter. Marine Le Pen was against the euro, but now she's very much pro-Europe. I mean, the same thing goes for Meloni, the same thing goes for practically all other European Eurosceptic parties. Pro-Europe, but we want to change a little bit of Europe regarding a lot of issues that are particularly those. So I think there is a pull moving from the center to the right and from the radical right to the center. So in the middle between something center right and radical right, in the middle between that, and even social democratic parties and Danish social democratic parties anti-immigration fall like that. Why? Simple as that, because voters are moving into that direction. So they capitalize those votes. Otherwise, they run away. They won election because of that, because they were anti-immigrant party. So social democrats won elections in Denmark because they assumed anti-immigration postures. That's simple.
Right. I think we're right at our time. It's supposed to be done by 42, right?
I think there was another question here.
So we'll pick it and then we'll use that. I apologize. Go ahead.
No, it's fine.
No, you got a couple of minutes if you want it.
Yeah, I know, but honestly, like I think it was something that was discussed, and I don't remember exactly what I wanted to ask, and so it's like better to not have something half group.
Fair enough. All right, thank you very much. It's been really good, and like a fairly, like an impressive